Great. All right. Welcome, everyone. How are you all doing? How's Ignite so far? All right. I love an interactive audience. Fantastic. All right, let's see if we cannot end day 2 on a high note here. The content for this deck is a coming together, as you can imagine, for a lot of people behind the scenes, but represented by the 4 folks here you're going to see on stage talking primarily, across 3 product lines, 2 continents, and what I'm hoping you will agree with at the end of the session, delivering one fantastic session. My name is Girish Chander. I'm a group program manager on the Office 365 team. My partners in crime are
Raviv.
And Michael Dubinsky.
Raviv is in the Windows team, Michael's in the Azure team, and he has to turn on his mic.
Jason Rogers.
Jason Rogers is demo god today. He's going to be showing you some cool stuff. We've kind of split this up into 3 parts. First, we want a level set, and then we'll do a bunch of cool demos, and then we try to do something different today, which is given that a lot of the integrations that we're going to talk about across the 3 product lines, yeah, we can go into some detail, but they're going to be detailed sessions, which we'll point you to. But so what we decided to do differently was, rather than us going into detail, which other sessions will do, we'll have us sit here as a panel, and Heike here is going to come and put us on the spot, along with the rest of you, I hope, to ask any and all questions related to the 3 stacks, how they work together, how they leverage each other's signals, and how they do better, to offer you a better protection, detection, and remediation paradigm across your advanced threat protection stack. Sound good? Yes, all right. Okay, let's level set a second. Security is clearly becoming a C-suite issue, right? Largely because it's not just the fact that the CXOs are actually being targeted, which they are, increasingly so, but also because it's fundamentally affecting the bottom line of different companies, right? If you take a look at some of these numbers, and the stats are just mind-boggling, depending on which side of the spectrum you want to look at, the average cost of a data breach ranges from anywhere between $4 to $15 million, right? Again, if you take the low end or a high end, it doesn't matter. That's still a pretty bad number, right? The number of days where a threat goes undetected, not captured here, again, ranges from between 90 days to 225 days. Again, whichever range of that spectrum you take, bad number. If you just look at the overall number of attacks that organizations are being subject to, take a look at the overall number of pieces of malware or phish that are being created increasingly every single day, that's just a mind-boggling number. So clearly, this is not just a security concern, and there's been security concerns, but it's an increasingly important security concern affecting organizations and the bottom line of organizations. So as we talk to CISOs, as we talk to CTOs and chief information officers across the customer base, it's clear that they're hitting a set of key challenges. Hey, how am I to defend the organization across all of these attacks? How am I going to be able to detect malicious activity quick enough? And how am I going to be able to respond to these in a manner that actually mitigates and lessens the impact that my organization is going to suffer, right? And if you think about it, attackers, they're actually going after every single piece of your infrastructure, whether it be your identity infrastructure, your apps, your critical data assets, or the devices that your employees use, or the core infrastructure that your enterprise is leveraging. Attackers are looking for vulnerabilities across every single piece of your environment, right? They just had to get it right once, right? Which is why it is super important to be able to apply the best of your threat protection stack across this infrastructure, right? And so there's a need for this comprehensive solution, one that spans the paradigm of, hey, how do I protect against these attacks? How do I detect them very quickly? And how do I respond to them super fast so I can mitigate the impact, I can lessen the impact, not just to my organization from a security perspective, but in a lot of cases from a brand perspective for the organization, right? And if you think about Microsoft's approach to this, it's along these 3 paradigms, but in a manner that can actually span your identity, your apps, your infrastructure, your devices, and your data. One of the things that we get super excited about is that we don't think about this as being silos, right? We think about this as, which?
We should be excited.
We're
We should be
super excited
excited.
about
Yeah,
that. I'm so
She's our,
excited.
she's our
that-
cue for the day. She's
Heike
like, if I
helps
say
us be excited.
on cue, please be excited. Anyways, one of the things that we get excited about really is the fact that we don't operate in these silos, and we're able to leverage the signals across these three stacks to be able to amplify the protection paradigm, right? If you just take a look at the Microsoft ecosystem, we have about 450 billion authentications on a monthly basis. You take a look at the number of emails that we analyze, 400 billion. You take a look at the Bing pages that we scan, 18 billion. If you just take a look at the breadth of the signal that we actually have at our disposal, right? The security graph is really about how do we make available across the ecosystem of products that we have this intelligence. A lot of you who've been in the security space for a while know that off late, the critical important factor to being able to protect your organizations from security relies on the data insights and the intelligence that you can derive out of it, right? And so that's the approach we've taken here as well, which is being able to intersect all of these signals so that each vector of our protection stack can actually leverage the signals, amplify it through machine learning intelligence, and then deliver that as a core product value across each of the stacks, right? And that's what we get super excited about because, again, the scale of the Microsoft ecosystem puts us in a fantastic place to be able to achieve that. Right? So I covered this, right? It's the signal breadth. You saw the breadth that we had, the intelligence that you can derive out of it, and then you can apply machine learning and AI over it to again further amplify that value. Right? Good.
Thank you. So let's see how it actually works in real-world scenarios. So first thing, based on the signals we're getting, we actually, one of the benefits of being at Microsoft is the fact that we work with thousands of enterprise customers where we both have the signals in terms of authentication, in terms of Windows devices reporting, in terms of emails that we're scanning, as well as incident response teams that are actually going on site to customers and are helping them investigate and respond to advanced attacks as they're on site. Now, based on that information, we've created this slide basically which shows how real-world attacks really operate. So the first thing, we know that in 90% of the cases, the attacks begin with a phishing email. In a lot of cases, the attackers begin with sending an email to a user in the organization after they actually perform some external reconnaissance. The attackers are not sending random emails to random people. They're going through LinkedIn, they're looking at who are the people that work for that company, what are their roles, and eventually when they find that specific person they want to target that is working in the HR department, they're sending them an email relevant to their work. They're sending them a report about some personnel. They're sending them an attachment which makes sense for them to open. Now, that email is being sent to the organization, and the first part is Office that scans those emails and looks at the attachments, detonates the attachments, looks at the URL, which is the other option of sending a malicious URL for the user to click and eventually either authenticate using that malicious URL providing the credentials, or that specific URL redirects to a malicious website which downloads malicious code to that specific endpoint. So the first attack vector, or the most common attack vector we see, is through emails. And this is why we're scanning all those emails. This is why we're scanning the URLs. Every time you click on a URL, we're checking what's the website behind that. Is there anything malicious on it? Now, the next part, once the attacker managed to send that email, if the organization is not covered by Office ATP, or in some cases, the attackers are actually using personal email accounts. Actually, I think one of the interesting stories I've heard for advanced attackers is that they wanted to target a CEO of a company. So they managed to breach the Gmail account of that CEO's brother. Now, going through those emails, they figured out they're planning going on a skiing trip at a specific day to a specific location. So they sent the CEO an email with a hotel, which redirected to a malicious website, to his personal email account, which he opened on his work device. Now, there is absolutely no way you could identify that email as a phishing email without actually scanning either the attachment or the URL. Seriously, one of the most sophisticated email campaigns I've heard about. So now that we have that specific email landing on the device, we have the user clicking on the email, clicking on the URL, opening the attachment. In a lot of cases, the attachment itself already contains malicious code. There are a lot of scenarios where you have macro code enabled on device, so security best practices, where you have some vulnerabilities that are actually being exploited, like Adobe vulnerabilities or other vulnerabilities that are actually exploiting stuff on the endpoint. So when the user opens the attachment, that's when the exploitation on the endpoint begins. So in a lot of cases, it starts with an exploit. In some cases, the attackers actually install something on the endpoint. In other cases, it's only the new trend is doing in-memory malware, so there is nothing on the disk, actually on the disk on the endpoint, only stuff that runs in memory, accesses, injects stuff into other processes, accesses credentials, and things like that. Now, another thing that always or in most cases happen, the attackers actually need to control those malwares. Those malwares are like bots. Without getting commands, they can do a specific set of tasks, but eventually they stop, right? So they need to get commands from somewhere. So this is the next part after we've deployed that malware, either in memory or on disk, is communicating with the command and control servers that the attackers own. Now, again, those communications could be very, very interesting. In some cases, those are dedicated servers. But in other cases, we actually saw malware communicating with the CNC server through forums. The malware was posting replies on forums when the C2 server was posting replies on those replies, and that was the communication between the malware running on the endpoint and the CNC server. So super complex, super advanced communication, and obviously the smarter the attackers are, nation state obviously employ smarter things than script kiddies. So it's anywhere between very basic communication to very advanced and hidden communications. And the next thing, the attackers are trying to gain persistency on the endpoint or in the organization. So those are two persistency stages, because if we're using only in-memory malware, then every time we reboot the box, the malware goes away. So we need another box to infect the first box every time the first box reboots. So in a lot of cases, that's actually how the malwares operate. They either deploy directly on the endpoint, or again, in the new trends, they have a specific amount of devices in the organization infected, and every time one device reboots, another device infects the first device. So constantly there is something running in the organization in terms of malicious code on the endpoint. And the next thing, the malware escalates their privileges. They want to get local admin privileges on the box. So in a lot of cases where all the users are local admin, that's easy. In some cases, not all the users are local admin, so that's a little bit harder. So we have malwares using kernel drivers. We have malwares using local system accounts and eventually exploiting that in order to perform privilege escalation on the endpoint. And once they've done that, the next phase is switching to credentials. So we have a device, we control that device. Now we need to begin move laterally on the organization. We want to escalate our user account privileges. So from a regular user account, we want to figure out how can we get to a domain admin. From a domain admin account, we want to start figuring out how can we stay in the organization as domain admins undetected as long as possible, and eventually gain access to the apps and data that is interesting for the attacker to exfiltrate those out of the organization. So once we've managed to get some persistence on the box, what the attackers usually are doing, they're compromising the credentials on that specific box, and they begin to move laterally on the organization in order to escalate their privileges to a domain admin. Once they've done that, they gain some kind of persistence, either adding them to sensitive groups, stealing the cryptGT in order to create golden tickets in the future, creating a bunch of user accounts, stealing the entire Active Directory database. All of those are techniques that are actually in use in the wild by attackers. And once they've done that, then as domain admins, they have the entire organization at their disposal. They can authenticate to any resource. They can authorize themselves to any data, to any file, to any website. And that's when actually the longer term of the attack takes place. So everything I spoke about until now takes a couple of days, usually, maybe a week. The next part is the hard part. Where is the data that I actually want to gain access? Let's say I've attacked, well, not I, someone, attacked a financial organization, right? They want to get the credit cards. They want to get access to the mainframe. That's the complex task. That's when they stop, the attackers are actually bringing the subject matter expert. So the first part was the IT guy, right? That's the general person that knows how to create malwares, how to exploit 0 days, that kind of stuff. The next part, I need to find someone who actually understands banking, who actually understands how financial systems work. Or another example, if I'm attacking a pharmaceutical organization, then I need someone who can actually differentiate between the formula for the next drug against cancer versus just a headache drug. So the next part takes weeks or months, and this is the number that Girish mentioned, that attackers go undetected because they're going in the organization trying to figure out where is the relevant data, where is the relevant application, and how can I get that out of the organization. So this is the flow of how attackers really attack behind the scenes. That's what we know from real-world examples. Again, based on Microsoft intelligence, based on the fact we're helping our customers. So now, let's see how our products actually help with that.
Yeah, just before I go off of the slide, I think a couple of things to amplify here is, hopefully this gives you a sense of why you need protection focus across the three areas, as we've called out, right? If you take a look at any of the high-profile attacks that we've actually seen come out in the news, they've all followed some variant of this path. Right? Which is why it's important to focus on the initial vectors that either may be through your collaboration software or email, focus on the persistence as it may be on devices, or persistence as it may actually look for lateral movement within your environment. All of these three things and the focus in terms of protection, detection, remediation needs to come together for you to be fully protected across your organization. Right? With that level set, let's talk about the Office 365 stack in terms of how we have capabilities and offerings that help you protect your email and collaboration vectors from attack. Right? If you take a look at, again, I'll throw another stat at you, 90 to 95, depending on which stat you choose to accept, 90 to 95% of attacks originate through an email. Right? This is why we, within Office 365 world, take the email protection vector very, very seriously. But having said that, we also see that attacks are actually translating from email-based attacks to other attacks where you have malicious files being hosted on things like OneDrive or SharePoint. And so we've expanded our offering to cover all of Office 365. So we think about our protection value along three pillars. There's the Exchange Online Protection, or EOP, which looks to protect you from the classic malware, phish, and spam-based attacks that your organizations are often targeted with. Right? This comes natively as part of your Exchange Online Protection, and it protects you regardless of whether your users are on-prem or in the cloud, as long as you have this cloud-based EOP value that you're leveraging. Over that, we layer the Advanced Threat Protection offering. This is where we can amplify your protection value by focusing on those zero-day attacks, by actually detonating these attacks that may not be known in the wild. We detonate these files, look for any indicators of compromise, and then block those attachments if they're looking to actually compromise you. And then, as Michael talked about, we offer this URL time-of-click protection, where if there's attackers will often take this path, where they will send you an email, and through email flow, we'll inspect the URL, and it'll look benign. And this is done intentionally. And the attackers will wait for a period of a couple of hours until they actually change the place where the URL points to, and that'll be an actual phishing site. So what we want to do is extend that protection value not just to a time of mail flow analysis, but at the time of click, we want to be able to do that analysis to give you the protection value, right? And that's the URL time of click protection. And then we have a bunch of ML-based algorithms that we are running to protect you from classic phish attacks and the malware-based attacks. We layer on top of this a protection paradigm called threat intelligence, where, again, this is about giving you all of the intel needed to protect your organizations. We take a corpus of all the information that we have across the signal base that we watch, and we tell you about emerging global threats, how it actually affects your organization. And we talk about the trends of attacks, how it actually is affecting maybe types of personas within your organization, and we call that out. We also provide you a rich exploration interface where you can go and say, hey, I actually noticed this attack, or I actually noticed this malicious file. Let me actually go figure out who else may have received this file, or who else may have received this URL. Let me explore that. And you get this built-in mechanism to actually have an incident response workflow within the Threat Explorer paradigm. Right? So we think about this in terms of the basic protection that comes with EOP, advanced zero-day protection value that comes with ATP, and the layer of intelligence that's crafted over it, which is our threat intelligence offering. That's the Office 365 stack. Make sense? All right, let's move on.
Makes sense to me. So when we talk about endpoint, which is sort of the realm we protect with Windows, we think about this sort of as to protect your endpoint is sort of a layered cake. So there's the first layer where we give you the opportunity where to secure your device by routing our security down all the way to the hardware by giving you awesome things like VSM and making sure that credentials are hidden. There's a second layer, basically, which is how do you configure that device before you even ship it out the door of the IT department to the users? How do you best configure that device in a way that reduces the attack surface on that device? That goodness all comes when you buy Windows 10 and you get that out of the box and you configure it. But that's not enough. There's two more things that we need to do, right? So we need to protect that device as we know that as we hand it over to the user is going to use it, things are going to happen. Attackers are going to try to get in. He's going to try to get exploited. Some of these things are going to come through email. Some of these things are going to come through other means. But essentially, things will happen. We need to protect that. That's that nice layer we have with the real-time security services like AV, which you could use ours. You could use third party. Smart Screen that basically protects you while you're browsing the web, which is, again, another layer of defense if it gets passed through. If it comes through an email and it gets passed, you have that nice layer of defense. But at the end of the day, we should assume that as good as all these defenses would be, attackers are smart. Some of them are nation state. They hold some unfair advantage because they would pay the money or they would find the zero-day exploits for those devices that our defensive tools will be harder for them to basically detect and respond to that. So with that in mind, what we did in Windows 10, we said, we need, if I liken that to a house, we don't need just to make sure that we have the best alarm system and that we lock all the doors and we put a guard at the door. We actually need to record everything that's happening. And that's kind of some of the goodness we brought with defense, with Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection is we're basically recording everything that's happening on that endpoint. We have a sensor. It's not an agent. It's actually built into the OS. We instrumented the hell out of the OS, and we did it smartly. So we're not looking at security logs. We're actually, when we needed to instrument things like kernel and memory, we actually sat with the memory manager team, or we sat with the kernel-based guys, and we said, here are the things that we think attackers are going to do. These are the vectors that we see them coming in. How can you guys instrument it for us so we will have that rich data so we can build that nice layer of detections on top of that? So we have a OS sensor that's built in, part of the box of what you get in Windows. There's another big advantage to that, which is performance, right? We have to keep to the strict performance gates and guidelines of Windows, which means it consumes basically nothing, almost. And it could run side by side with whatever you have. Like if you have any other thing that you're running on the box, it could run side by side with it. And then we collect all that rich signal information, and we do a couple of things with that. We take it to the cloud, and then the first thing we do is we give you that information. So anything that we see on those machines up to 6 months back on any machine that you have, we serve it back. You get that rich information. It's not raw. We actually curate it to be nicely for you. So you can see all the entities, machines, IPs, files, processes, whatever we have. It's at your fingertip. You can search it. You can see it. You can see every machine and everything that it's done. And then on top of that, what we do is we build that nice layer of analytics. This is kind of the power of where we could use the awesomeness of the graph. We can use our data. We could use what we see from the 420 million other machines that run our AV. We know things from what we know the techniques are that the attackers are using. And this is where we're running our analytics. And the focus of our analytics is not to look for the mundane things. Like we're not looking for hashes. Okay? We're not looking for things that have happened before. If we look at our own statistics, most of the time, everything's polymorphic. Like attackers don't do the mistake of repeating the things that they've done before because they know that they get detected by AVs and they just avoid it. So all of our detection is basically behavioral, anomaly, and known techniques that we know that attackers might be using. And the idea is that we want to find those suspicious things. We know the attackers are kind of trying to hide in the noise in the network, and that's kind of what we do, which is why I'm so excited when these two guys share more signals, because that's the chance for us to get them, because we only need them, same thing that they only need all of us to have one weak point in that chain. We only need them to make one mistake during that whole process. And it takes weeks or days, We need them to make one mistake to find out that they're there, and then just pull out that whole thing and see how the attack unfolds. That's what we're trying to do. So it's basically a sensor that we have in the OS combined with the analytics that we bring from the cloud. The other layer that we've just added, don't know if you've been to the other session or you're going to the other Windows ATP sessions, in RS3, that's coming in the Creators Fall update, we're going to do some awesome stuff beyond just the detection. So it's not just the data and the detections. We're actually going to, because of the richness of the data we have, we're already going to provide analytics. This is also perfectly aligned with what the Office guys are doing. So we're not just telling you there's something suspicious on the box. We can tell you what the state of the box is. We can tell you if the box is properly patched with all the security patches that it should have. We can tell you if the state of the sensor is running accordingly. And for the entire stack of all the security features in Windows, we can tell you whether they're switched on and whether they're properly configured compared to our baseline. So you can know if a machine is at risk of being hit because you set a security baseline, but that policy is not actually being enforced on the box. And the last piece is we use then the underlying features in Windows to provide you with that protection. So if we want to do something on the box, if we want to isolate the box, if we want to scan the box, if we want to hit a file, any of these things, we actually use what's on the box. So again, no agents, no performance hit, nothing that should kind of bother you in terms of what the user is actually doing. Users should work on the box as intended.
So now let's have a look at what happens with the identity. So we went through the email, we went through the endpoint. The next part is the identity stack. So actually earlier today, we introduced Azure ATP, the new cloud offering to detect advanced attacks in the on-premises, cloud, and hybrid environments. Now, the way Azure ATP works, first of all, we need to collect the data. So as Raviv mentioned, in Windows 10, there is a lot of stuff instrumented for the endpoint detection. With Azure ATP, we're interested in how identities behave, right? We're interested at the authentication, we're interested at the authorization. Now, in order to do that, we're collecting the information from the on-premises domain controllers. This is the central source of all the authentications, all the authorizations that are happening in the organization. The way we're doing that is by deploying a sensor to the domain controllers or a standalone sensor with port mirroring, and we analyze all the network traffic because this is where the authentications are coming from, through the network. And we're analyzing them, and we're passing the network traffic up to the application layer protocols. What does that mean? Application layer is that, how many of you ever opened Wireshark to look at Kerberos or SMB traffic? Okay, fair amount. So,
sorry, I'm scanning the room.
Good thing Heike is here. Layer 7 is basically what you see in Wireshark when you look at the Kerberos protocol, right? So you see the user account, you see the encryption type, you actually see the cipher of the Kerberos ticket. All that information is being parsed by Azure ATP, together with additional information both from the on-premises, like event logs from member servers, events from the domain controllers, VPN data, which we can collect using radius accounting. And with Azure ATP, we're currently working very hard on integrating with first and third-party cloud data sources. So things like Azure Active Directory, Office authentications. So those are all things we want to understand in order to build the behavioral profile of how the user really works in the organization. How is that specific identity, how is that specific user really operates? Which resources do they access? Which machines are they logging in from? Regardless of whether that's on premises or in the cloud. Now, all that information is then being stored in the user's profile in order to really understand how the users behave. One of the key challenges actually we had for that is all the information we see in the event logs or network traffic are mostly IP addresses. Now, it's really hard to build a profile and say, oh, that's really malicious where the user logged in from IP 10.1.5.7, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense when we look at IP addresses. We really need to figure out what's the device, because really the faulting entity behind the compromised account is the compromised device. So we have a unique IP resolution mechanism where we take each IP address and we actually profile every single packet that comes from that specific IP address, and we also perform proactive querying to that IP address. So that means we know exactly which device operates on which IP address at which point in time. So then, when we get a network traffic, we can actually query and say, hey, what's the device on that specific IP address at that specific time? And then we can know that it's Raviv's laptop. So now we can say, hey, we know that Raviv authenticated from his laptop. That's very useful when building a behavior profile in order to perform the detections of the abnormal behavior. So basically the next part of how we detect things is we're looking at how the users and entities really operate in the organization. Which devices are they logging in from normally? Which resources are they logging in, are they accessing normally? And we're comparing their behavior profile to themselves, what's normal for that specific user, to their peers. So a peer could be the PM group located in Israel, which is Raviv and I are both located, or it could be the engineering team of Office. So depending on the user, we're calculating the peers for that specific account and compare to the organization. And then we build a machine learning model to understand what's normal and what's abnormal. So if we take lateral movement, for example, once we have the malware that compromised the credentials from the endpoint, those compromised credentials can be used to log into a dozen different endpoints in the organization. This is how attackers really work. Now, knowing that Raviv is usually working from his 3 devices, his laptop, his desktop device, and his mobile device, now we can say that, hey, if we've seen Raviv's account logging in from 20 different devices in the organization, especially if those devices are in the United States and in Europe and not only in Israel, that looks suspicious, and we can alert on that. So that's the statistical model that we have in Azure ATP in order to detect abnormal behavior. The other side of that are the suspicious activities. So suspicious activities are actually activities that shouldn't happen in the organization. So based on the breadth of information we have at Microsoft, we know what's normal and what is suspicious. So for example, performing a replication request from a non-domain controller, that looks suspicious. Looking at a bunch of reconnaissance or specific queries using net user or net group from a bunch of devices, that's something that is suspicious. That shouldn't be happening. So that's also another thing we can detect. And actually, we have a security research team that constantly looks at how attackers operate based on Microsoft intelligence, as well as based on what's happening in the security research community. So based on those data sources, we're actually engineering our detections into Azure ATP. And last thing is the alert and investigation. So obviously, we're providing the alert with all the information regarding what is the reason Azure ATP decided that to open that specific alert, the evidence for investigating that specific alert, as well as a dedicated profile page, which we're actually re-engineering as we speak in order to provide all the information about all the operations the user did in the organization, as well as pivoting from the compromised identity to the compromised endpoint in Windows Defender ATP. So every time we see a user perform the suspicious activity or an abnormal behavior, we're providing the exact endpoint from which that behavior occurred and showing you how many alerts are there in Windows Defender ATP if that's deployed, as well as pivoting directly to Windows Defender ATP to understand exactly what happened on that specific endpoint. So with that, I think we've talked enough.
Yeah, show me a demo.
Yeah, let's do a long demo.
A long demo, here we go. So today we've seen how a typical advanced attack looks through Office 365, through Windows, and through Azure. And we've seen how Office 365 ATP, Windows ATP, and Azure ATP detects those attacks. Now, before we started this session, I actually launched 2 attacks. So I could show you, hopefully, how these things work together and how signals that we gain from those 400 billion emails that are scanned every month and the billion attachments that we detonate in our sandbox, how those signals are shared with the endpoints to protect those as well. Then I'm also going to show how Windows ATP detections are fed back into Office so EOP can leverage what we've learned in Windows Defender ATP, once again, through the intelligent security graph. So this was a Word macro Trojan downloader that had been morphed. ATP detected it, so we can see that it said it's an unsafe attachment. Now, I didn't just send this file to the Office 365 account. I also sent it through Gmail.
I want to see it.
So now, if I download this file from Gmail, It's detected by Windows Defender AV on the endpoint. Now, the second attack I sent through Gmail first. And I think that one actually ended up in the spam folder. So this one is actually an executable dropper inside of a Word doc. So I'll go ahead and trust this because I'm a trustable guy. Oops, shouldn't have trusted it. So now Windows Defender ATP detected what happened on this endpoint. So let me show you what that looks like. So if we come over to Security Center, oh, geez, you can see that I've been playing around with this quite a bit today. So it detected that their file dropper, docm, probably should have done a better job in naming that if I was trying to hide it, huh? So it launched PowerShell, and it built a base64 encoded executable that then went and did some bad things on the endpoint. So now I'm going to go ahead and take that same file, and I'm going to send it to Office 365. Let me close that. Oh, there it is. So you can see this actually wasn't an Office 365 ATP detection at this point. This was detected in EOP. So we took what we knew about that detection in Windows Defender ATP, used the intelligent security graph, and shared it with EOP, where now it's been blocked based on what we know about that file and reputation.
So
Jason, we should talk about you trusting some untrusted emails.
Yeah. By the way, one of the interesting things that happened.
Go ahead.
So several things happened there. One of the interesting things is as you were preparing the demo and you're running it, and Windows ATP detected it, Windows ATP. So this is kind of AV learned in parallel that something was wrong with this. So first time it let you run it. Second time the cloud blocked it because that was a suspicious thing, and the signals don't go just across to ATA, like to Azure ATP and to Office ATP. They also kind of go across the stack within Windows. So Windows ATP also talks to Windows AV. So you're kind of seeing all of that happening in parallel.
And to build on that, you saw Jason referring to EOP versus ATP with reference to the Office stack. This is about how we are amplifying, again, signals that we're taking across the Windows stack and what we're learning, and then pushing it down to value for everybody who's got a mailbox on Office 365. So you get the advantage of this detection and the signal and the prevention logic across any mailbox, regardless, even if you don't have the advanced queues around advanced threat protection and TI. Does that make sense? Question?
Was the EOP block a result of a file hash match, or did it separately pull it off and detonate?
Jason?
No, this was the file hash being shared back from the Windows Defender ATP detection on the endpoint.
Great. So now let's look at the other side of the stack. Let's have a look at Azure ATP, the types of detections we have there, and how we can, again, pivot back to Windows Defender ATP and see what's happening there. So first of all, in terms of the attack timeline, we see already there are several alerts that Azure ATP detected in the organization. The attack actually started with a reconnaissance attempt. So think about it. When the attacker lands in the organization, when they land on the endpoint, they have absolutely no idea how the environment looks like. What server names are there, which usernames are there. So one of the techniques that the attacker is using, they're actually coming with a dictionary of users. And in this example, they've performed a reconnaissance attempt for specific usernames in order to understand what are valid users in the organization. So in this example, we have a dictionary of a bunch of non-existent users, and the attacker successfully performed reconnaissance on 3 specific accounts. Now, the next thing the attackers did in order to compromise additional accounts, in this example, the attacker decided not to perform a lateral movement, but to perform an attack called password spraying. Password spraying is basically a brute force technique, but unlike the regular brute force when we take thousands of passwords and we try them on several accounts, password spraying is actually taking a very low number of passwords, let's say 4 or 5 passwords, and attempting those passwords on a bunch of users in the organization. So in this example, we can see that the attacker attempted several passwords on several accounts in the organization. Now, the thing is, with Azure ATP, we provide you with the reason why we decided that it's suspicious. So 2 accounts never logging into that specific device, but we also provide you with the evidence. So the evidence are relevant for the investigation in order to decide whether that's a true positive or a false positive alert. So in this example, the evidence that we have is that that specific device has been operating without any failed authentications for quite a while. So that leads us to think that it's not like misconfiguration on the device or a scheduled task that runs with old credentials or things like that. And another evidence we can say is that none of the passwords attempted for that operations are any of the previous passwords. So again, a very common false positive is that we change the password, there is a logon session on several servers, and that causes us to detect brute force in the traditional rule-based mechanisms of, hey, let's see a bunch of failed authentications in a small amount of time and call that a brute force. Well, not necessarily. And the last thing is none of the users actually changed their passwords in the last 24 hours. So the attacker attempted that brute force attempt. That wasn't very successful. But what we can see is that the attacker then managed to escalate their privileges using a golden ticket activity. So a golden ticket is basically when the attacker manages to craft a Kerberos ticket offline, and what he needs for that is the KRB TGT password hash. So in some cases, we've seen attackers stealing the KRB TGT password hash, going home, coming back after a couple of weeks or a couple of months with a golden ticket, and even embedding that specific golden ticket into a piece of malware. So that means they can be whoever they want, whenever they want, and the username have absolutely nothing to do with it. So golden ticket basically means you can create a Kerberos ticket and you inject security IDs into the Kerberos ticket based on whatever you want. So I can say, hey, I'm Raviv, but I'll have the domain admin's security ID inside my Kerberos ticket. This is what the golden ticket means. So in this example, again, we see that Azure ATP detected a golden ticket activity based on anomalous time usage. So we know what's the normal amount of time Kerberos ticket should be used, and we've seen that specific Kerberos ticket being used over the normal amount of time. And again, we can see all the evidence, when was the first usage, when was the last usage, what's the Kerberos lifetime in your organization, because obviously you can change it, and eventually, which user account or which devices that specific user account has been logging in from. So again, we can see exactly the devices that the user has been using. And last but not least, detection. Once the attackers manage to escalate their privileges, in this example is the golden ticket detection, the attacker wanted to gain some persistence in the organization. Why do they need persistence? Because once they've managed to attack the organization and gain a highly privileged account, they want to be able to come back whenever they want to that specific organization. So in this example, the attacker managed to gain persistence by adding themselves or adding a regular account controlled by an attacker, in this example, the Jackson Kiefer's account, adding that account to a help desk group. Now, that specific help desk group is a nested member of the domain admins group in the organization. And again, we can see that in the evidence. Now, before we switch, the most important thing here is that we want to understand what is the scope of the breach, and we want to begin the investigation. So now we know that we have an attack campaign that happened in the organization. We know the attackers gained persistence. And in this example, we know that the attackers gained access to the help desk account because they used it in order to add Jackson's account into the help desk group. So in the evidence section, again, we have the endpoint from which that attack was executed. We can pivot to the endpoint. We can see all the relevant information, like who are the users that logged into that specific endpoint, who are the resources that endpoint accessed, what are the security alerts. But we can also look at what's happening on that specific endpoint in Windows Defender ATP. So now that I'm looking at the compromised endpoint, I've looked at the compromised identity. I know that I have several identities that were compromised. All of them were compromised from that specific endpoint. Looking at Windows Defender ATP, now I can match that information. I can say, hey, I have 4 alerts in Azure ATP, which involves that specific endpoint. That means there's a lot of compromised identities operating on that endpoint. And now in Windows Defender ATP, I have this list of alerts that I can actually see that a vulnerable driver was used by the attackers in order to escalate their privileges. They injected some malicious code into the user's context, and that's how they managed to compromise that specific user account from which they began their attack. So again, going back across the kill chain, we can see how Azure ATP detected the compromised identity. From there, we went to the compromised endpoint, and we can now see how that specific endpoint was compromised. And from Windows Defender ATP, we can continue across the chain and pivot to Office ATP in order, if email was the case, in order to understand exactly using which vector, using which email, using which attachment, that specific endpoint was compromised. So this is the overview of how investigating an attack across the 3 products actually makes your life much, much easier based on how attackers really operate. So now let's invite Heike.
I'm here. Thank you.
Hi.
So can I get a seat?
Sure.
Or do I need to stand around here? Thank you. Okay, so we have prepared some questions that we know we get all the time. So, but after those questions, you're happy to join us in asking a question on one of those mics. So you talked about detection or signal exchange already a little while. So what does it exactly mean? So I'm bringing up this question first. So what kind of signals do you share between the different products? That'll be first.
So I think there's, again, there's different tiers of things that we could do. I think the most basic thing that we're enabling, and you'll see more of, is basically just the ability to get the full picture. So if you're looking at something and you're looking at an endpoint, and you're seeing a potential compromise on the endpoint, you need to know what's happening in the identity realm. So you need to have that ability to seamlessly move and see what's happening with that user. And although each one of us, and like the parallel of that would be if this potentially originated from him, we need to know, has this been in any mailbox in my network, right? That attachment or that user. What else is happening on the email realm? And there has to be that seamless transition. I think with what's coming up now in Creators Fall and with the recent updates to both Azure ATP and Office ATP, we've completed that. So we're giving you that nice, still not one UI, but we're giving that nice way of pivoting across seamlessly between the UIs, sharing that information in a way that if I know something that's compromised on the machine and I have alerts, you should be able to see that in Azure ATP. If Office has any indication that something bad that's happening with an account, you should be able to see that on the Windows ATP. That's kind of the first tier of things. Behind the scene, then it becomes more interesting because we can share that signal. So the first layer there is just being able to access that data, that richness of data that comes from the other ATPs, and that has to come across because in each of our realms we make our own decisions about what constitutes a compromise, what constitutes something that's suspicious. So consuming those opinions and then taking our own decision, but also sharing that data so other ATPs could take their own decision as to what constitutes a compromise. Beyond that, there's detection. So if I know that something's bad, it's shared. Actually, when we know that something's bad, it's shared beyond just the 3 of us. It actually gets shared across all Microsoft. Because if this is a file and it's a known bad file, there's no reason that it shouldn't be blocked by any of the Microsoft assets everywhere. So we take care to actually share these things even beyond just the 3 ATP services. And beyond that, there's the complex stuff. For instance, if I know that the machine is potentially compromised, how do I pass that signal along to Girish? So he can take a decision probably that if that box is not completely trusted, maybe I should apply conditional access on that and don't let the user read any emails on that specific box because that box is compromised. So there's those different tiers of insights and detections and just knowledge that we can share across. And I think we're going down that path of sharing more and more of that information.
So this brings me to the topic ransomware. It's a huge concern for most of our customers.
Yeah.
And I mean, exchanging signals and detections sounds already very great also from this kind of perspective. Most of the ransomware probably is like a link in an email. It's something that's coming in via email, as we know. As you told it, like 90 or 95%. So what is your answer to the ransomware topic?
I think it's a pertinent question, given especially how ransomware is so top of mind in so many people with recent attacks like WannaCry. It is true that email remains one of the top vectors of attack. Things take a look like Lockheed and other forms of ransomware attacks. But WannaCry, for example, was not an email-based vector, right? It actually came in, for those of you who don't know, it actually came in with a software update. So as we think about ransomware protection, we will continue to amplify this through signal exchange, through the things that we do in email. If it's a link, we'll chase it. If it's an attachment, we'll inspect it. We'll look for nefarious things the attachment or the executable within the attachment is trying to do. Things like, is it trying to encrypt the disk? Is it trying to write the registry? Is it trying to reach out to a command and control server? Those kinds of things we'll do in mail flow as part of our detonation activity in ATP. And we'll feed those signals downstream to, across Office and across Windows and Azure as well. But it works the other way too. As I said, WannaCry, for example, first hit through a software update on one of the Windows packages.
I think you mean Petya.
Sorry?
Petya.
Petya, and actually both Petya and non-Petya. And so you actually want to get the signals the other way as well, which is you get signals from Windows if that's the first instigator of the vector, and you want to be prepared for any morph that may actually move this to an email-based vector or a collaboration-based vector, by hosting it on a SharePoint site, for example. That we're seeing increasingly as well through external guest sharing or through compromised accounts. And so the signal sharing in the context of ransomware, we try and do this, again, both upstream and downstream, because we think the attacks are evolving, going beyond email to, as I said, software package updates or SharePoint OneDrive.
So one more thing about specifically WannaCry and Petya is that both of them were using, well, specifically WannaCry was using a vulnerability in the authentication mechanism of SMB. So when we were looking at authentications to the domain controller, we were actually able to detect WannaCry scanning or attempts to exploit that specific vulnerability. So that's specifically for WannaCry. For the NotPetya case, it was actually a very sophisticated piece of malware that came through a software update, not a Windows software update, but a third-party software update. But the thing is, it operated like regular malware. So it landed on a device. It compromised credentials. Basically, it stole credentials from the memory. It used those credentials to spread across the network and perform lateral movement. And again, Azure ATP was able to detect that specifically using the abnormal behavior detection when we saw the same set of credentials being used on a bunch of devices. Technically, those were all the devices in the same subnet. So when going through the investigation, we could figure out, hey, that looks malicious, like the user logging in on all the devices available in the same subnet. That doesn't make sense, and pivoting back to Windows Defender ATP actually made us understand exactly what's going on there for that specific scenario. So.
I just want to comment that both these things weren't really ransomware. Destructive malware masquerading as ransomware.
Okay, so that means Windows Defender ATP also had detection coverage for these malicious
I think so.
things.
There's a lot of work done in Windows with regards to ransomware. I think the AV guys have done like leaps ahead in the last year in the work that they've done. We've announced some of the things yesterday, like Folder Guard, and improvements in OneDrive where you could basically recover some of your history of your files in OneDrive, which is a new thing that's coming out. But in general, I think it's a matter of how fast can we exchange these signals, because we each see kind of a part of this. Yep. And in both those cases, by the way, the answer was how fast can you understand that you're under attack, because both these things were traveling pretty fast within the organization, although Petya being kind of nation-state attack, it was trying to limit it to a specific country. However, some multinationals got hit. It was a man, and but Microsoft being one of them, by the way. So the idea there was, how fast can we get that red screen that says, "Oh my God, you're screwed. You need to pull the plug and like disconnect those machines before it becomes worse."
And also kind of driving clarity to customers in terms of saying, hey, this is what it is versus it is not. If you lived through that first 24 hours, it was pretty chaotic, trying to figure out what it was and what it wasn't. And as you called out, these turned out, initially it was all called out as ransomware, and it turned out to be destructive malware. But through that initial period was about analyzing and exchanging signals across the security community, specifically across the 3 product lines here, to make sure that we provided clarity not just for ourselves, but also to customers through the various offerings.
So just in that case specifically, in the Microsoft case, because we're protecting Microsoft, we were alerting on this thing within like 10 minutes from the start of the attack as the volume started to grow. And basically Microsoft IT, I'm talking about Petya, Microsoft IT took the wise decision of just, again, cutting the cord and taking all those machines offline and basically kind of isolating that part of the network. In part because we were fast enough to understand something bad's happening.
So, thanks, Wes. You were talking about it's important to exchange these signals quickly. So you exchange through the cloud. So this brings me to the question, like many customers still would like to have something on-prem. They don't really, either they cannot go to the cloud or they're in the process of moving to the cloud. So what do we have on-prem, Michael?
So as I mentioned, the goal of Azure ATP is to combine the behavior of identities on premises and in the cloud. Most organizations are in some state of transition from being 100% on premises to having some resources in the cloud, some resources in the on-prem. However, if you're 100% on-prem, you don't want to hear about the cloud, we do have the on-prem version of Advanced Threat Analytics. However, there is no signal exchange that is available with cloud services. There is no integration with identities in the cloud. So basically, you're contained to your own premises, and the analytics you have there, that's what you get. So this is suitable, again, for customers that are 100% on premises, but it would make the life of investigating an attack, for example, the way I showed of pivoting to Windows Defender ATP, much, much harder. So even if you're an on-prem customer, but you want to enjoy those kind of signal exchange and integrations, you should definitely look into the cloud version of Azure ATP.
So we are putting Windows Defender ATP and Office 365 ATP on an on-prem box as well, and then we exchange signals?
Today you already get the protection value of Office ATP, even if you have your mailboxes on premises.
Yeah, you
right?
mentioned this earlier. As long as
the mail flow protection paradigm still applies, even though the mailboxes are actually on-prem. You just have to point the relevant damage records in the cloud, and that works. There are some capabilities, like we have a capability that we call ZAP, or zero-hour auto purge, where in the event through a learned signal that either comes from one of these 2 gentlemen here or through the overall security community, we learn about an attack that probably went through. We're able to react quickly, and we have this feature called ZAP that will be able to go into the mailboxes and remove the offending email or the attachment. Right? Now that capability works if you have your mailbox in the cloud. That's the one capability we don't have for on-prem mailboxes, but the overall value in terms of the detonation value, in terms of protecting from malicious URLs or attachments, that applies regardless of where your mailbox is. That said, we want people to move more aggressively to the cloud for the stuff that Michael mentioned, and also for the more complete protection value and the intel value that we can offer.
Okay.
So I'll just complete that. I'll be the bad boy. Like, we do cloud, and we do that intentionally. There's a lot of reasons why we do cloud and we don't do on-prem. Just to mention a few of them, we really want to hide what we're doing from the attacker. The cloud enables us to run analytics at a scale that we can never do if we do that on-prem. We don't want to go into how do you update signatures or push things down and up, and are you up to date or not. Cloud enables you to be real-time up to date all the time. And we've gone to a very considerable amount of investment, much like Office, making sure that any data that gets sent to the cloud is stored in a way that is secure, trusted, compliant, in a way that we actually don't see it. And as Microsoft, we cannot access it. It is yours, and you're the only one who should be enjoying it, and you should be enjoying it together with anything that we can put on top of that to help you protect yourself and better investigate or respond to things that are happening. So
Yeah.
cloud, go cloud.
Cloud.
Go cloud.
Yep.
So, if you have any third-party solutions helping you detecting similar things, how does Azure ATP work with third-party technologies?
So for us, we can definitely complement the third-party solutions that customers have. So either that's analytics on the SIEM, so we even have integrations with SIEM to get data from the SIEM to Azure ATP in order to perform detections on top of that. And the sensor on the domain controller, that's actually something very, very unique to Azure ATP, the fact that we're parsing the network traffic up to layer 7. So again, deploying that sensor on the domain controller, very minimal impact on the domain controller, but it works with any other analytics you may have on top of the events or NetFlow data or anything you can have on premises. So
What about Windows Defender ATP?
So again, I kind of mentioned that before. When we built the sensor, when we put it into the OS, we made sure that we're not hooking into anything that could interfere with anything that any other product that's running on the endpoint is doing. So assuming out of the ATP suite, you're running the basic sensor that we have that gives you most of the protection, it can run side by side with whatever you want to run. If you're running our AV, naturally only one AV can rule the box, but you don't have to. I recommend you do, but you don't have to. And that also applies to anything that the product would do. So in a sense, if we're using anything to do isolation and we're using the host firewall to isolate the machine, that could work in parallel to anything else that's happening. Other thing I want to say about the third parties is in this creators fall update, we've went to great lengths to expose tons of APIs out to enable any third party that you might have and enable you and enable your security team to basically have access anything that we know that is yours, that you agree to expose out, basically exposed through an API, starting from any IOC or threat intelligence stream that you want to push to us. So we would detect it, to anything that you see in the portal can be accessed by external systems. If your SIEM system or ticketing system or any other security system wants to ask a question about something that we know, it is accessible. If you want to instruct us to do things, it is accessible. Anything that we do can be done there. And again, all the standard stuff like hooking up to SIEM systems and pushing alerts out, like we all do that. I think one of the opportunities for us is like to have a single interface for that across. Definitely on the list.
Are there any third-party applications for Office?
It's interesting to talk about third-party in the context of just partnerships, as you may think about the way we use it in the protection stack. One of the things that didn't get amplified through the conversation earlier today is the fact that our approach to security actually relies on not just building a great partnership internally across the stacks, but it's actually building a great partnership with the security community outside of Microsoft as well, right? Both from a response and remediation as well as early signals of threats and feeding that into our optics. Whether you talk in terms of reputation lists or threat intel feeds or working with government agencies to take down command and control servers, Microsoft actually takes a pretty comprehensive approach to partnering with these folks so that we can keep the internet at large and our customer base more protected, right? And so that's in terms of kind of partnerships that a lot of times happens behind the scenes, and you may not be aware of that in very obvious ways. And then it's about people who are looking to layer on top of it as add-on solutions, right? There are a number of products out there that layer on top of our protection stack in terms of plugging into our management activity API feeds, again, SIEM partnerships, etc. So that continues to exist. But I think the more interesting notion is this partnership that actually happens behind the scenes that you don't actually see often.
Okay. So I know that we have separate engineering groups and everybody's doing an amazing job in building the product, and you have actually experts in security when it comes to Office files or Office workload. Your guys, they know everything about identity, and Ravi's guys know everything about the endpoint. So now we have three good-looking consoles. And I mean, I know from our customers, they really appreciate that you can seamlessly pivot between the different consoles without losing context. You're right there where you want to be. So is there like a vision, a path of making this maybe one single UI for our customers? So everybody like, what? Avi,
go ahead.
Ouch.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Yeah, it's kind of a sore point. I think where it's going is definitely eventually this is going to be, I think, a single portal. I think there's several factors here. One is like who's the persona that this is targeting. So I think there's like, is it the security operations, security administration, email administrator? So we need to figure out sort of who's using which console and for what scenarios. The other thing which you're starting to see is we're trying to get a single look and feel for things. So you have like maybe a common navigation between these things. We've started to kind of talk between us about entities, like how do we align the entities? When we say that it's a high value asset in Office, what does that mean for an endpoint? What does that mean for identity? And how do we align these things and how we tag them in a way that you have a common language across? Eventually, I think it's going to merge. There's a lot of talks about that, but for now we're doing our best to basically let whoever's using the system to get a comprehensive understanding of what's going on just by aligning the language, and you'll see that evolving in the next couple of months. So.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say this is very much a space that's evolving. One of the things we're focusing on right now, and I believe rightly so, because security and protection is what we're after first, is the signal exchange so we can be more effective across the board. But giving that experience in a kind of integrated manner is certainly on the cards, and it's kind of evolving as we kind of factor in the different personas, as we factor in feedback from customers, as we factor in how people want to see this path of investigation flows across the three products. And so Ravi was right, this is an evolving space, and feedback absolutely welcome, of course. But it's something we're working towards.
Yeah, but I think as long as you don't have to like sign in again and have different look and feel, it's already a
Those
huge
are like
step.
basics.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Table stakes.
The basics are there.
Yes. So are there any questions from the audience? I asked the questions.
And I think we should move ahead because we've not been showing this part of the audience.
Yeah, this
a lot.
is like we left them out. I'm sorry. I'm like I tried actually
go
to
down?
like, not
Stand
show
here
you
so
my
they can
back all the
see-
time.
They can
down?
see your handsome faces at least.
Just a quick question. Are there going to be any labs available for this?
I'm sorry, can you
Labs.
repeat
Are
that?
there going to be like pre-populated labs available?
Pre-populated labs available. I don't know, did we
Kind of like
say-
OMS, they have one, they have like 500 servers in it, you can play around OMS.
No.
So is there something like that to kind of walk through a threat?
So we don't have this today. I know that at least for Windows Defender ATP, we are looking to make something like this available for partners right now. Sure. I don't know about exposing this to everyone in our, virtual lab, virtual academy. But it's a good point. So let me take this and we will work on this.
Yeah, good suggestion.
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually work for a Microsoft partner, how would we hook up to get part of that partner lab, or is that, you want to have that offline?
So it will be demos.microsoft.com, and you have to have either a device competency or security.
We do, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you.
But give it a little bit of time. It's not there yet.
Yeah.
I'm going to sign in the next 5 minutes.
Yes, I can see you already asking like 5 minutes.
I guess we keep bouncing around. So we'll try one there and then go.
Okay, hi guys. I hope you don't mind a bit of a one-off. I have a customer who's really concerned about a brute force attack, and up until now, none of the Microsoft security solutions seem to have a way to detect this. They're very concerned about a single IP address from an attacker trying to log into multiple accounts in a small window of time, say.
That's yours.
That's basically the detection that we've showed. So right now, this is available against on-prem resources. As I mentioned, working very hard on integrating cloud resources. So in the near future, it will also be available against cloud resources. The same kind of technique, but yeah, we're definitely aware of that technique, and this is exactly what that specific detection is built to detect.
So stand by. Okay.
No,
Yeah,
it's
actually,
there.
not just stand by. Use.
Try Azure ATP. Try Azure
wait 2
ATP.
weeks. If it
Deploy
doesn't happen,
try the
email
attack,
him.
and give us feedback.
Okay, thank you guys.
That was going to be one of mine as well, was in the demo you mentioned 2 accounts, 200 attempts. If you had 200 attempts across 200 accounts, that would also still be flagged?
Yep.
Okay. And then the other one that I had was for NotPetya, they had like a 99% infection rate across 30,000 hosts in a 10-minute time span or something.
Yeah.
Is there any way to, and obviously you run into the problem of hitting valid actual admin attempts, opening up PS session to whatever with a script or anything, but is there any way to to prevent that, or is it just a purely reactionary, hey, we saw this happen, you probably need to go do something?
Depends, right? So if we can, whatever we can do to stop, we try to stop. So like AV, I think, I don't remember the exact timing, but once the AV adjusted, like the time period like was basically minutes or an hour or so, it tried to stop. Again, in this case, it was going like mad, right? So we try to balance, but it's a combination. If we can stop it, we definitely try to stop it. But if not, at least you need to know that's to happen. Yeah, so, yeah.
So
with
the other thing I think, you want, go ahead. Okay, so in terms of identities, it actually leveraged compromise. So the way it did it, it attempted to steal credentials, authenticate using those credentials to everyone on the subnet. If that failed, it attempted the same vulnerability that WannaCry attempted, and if that failed, it failed, right? So the thing is that we learned is that the user account on your device actually has access to almost all the devices on the subnet. So one of the things in terms of credential hygiene, well, two things. One I'm going to recommend regardless of the NotPetya malware is that in some cases we've seen things like scheduled task or service accounts with domain admin privileges running on all the endpoints in the organization. Now the thing is the attacker don't need to move laterally for that. They land on a device that are domain admins, that's it. Game over, done. So one thing is to make sure you know where your privileged accounts are running. And the second thing, to make sure that you're siloing your identities in terms of authentications to wherever they need to be. Right? So if an identity don't need to authenticate to a specific endpoint, there is no need for it to have privileges to authenticate to that specific endpoint. Right? So there are features to help with that both in Windows and Active Directory. So yeah, so that's the recommendation.
I guess back to the original question a little bit. How much tuning is there as far as, if you were to see something like that triggered on a actual legit admin activity, can you go in and whitelist those things so that they don't show every time, or?
So when you say whitelist, those things will
So,
be...
like an admin account hitting a ton of different systems?
Yeah,
Okay.
You can exclude that specific behavior, you can exclude that specific account, so that's available.
At a generic level, I think the strategy you're going to see, and she alluded to this, is it's not just about providing you the raw signals of activity, it's about actually providing you key insights along with remediation. In some cases automatic or policy controlled. In other cases, go very directed prescriptive alerting that says, hey, go do this.
Yep.
Take this quick response. That's a strategy you'll continue to see us focus on.
Plus, it's important to say so there's no learning period. Yes, some of the algorithms do learn over time what an anomaly is, but the thing should work out of the box, right? You turn it on, it should be working. So it's always a combination, right? We don't choose one thing, go after it, right? Like if in the AV world, there's like, either you go with, forget about the signatures and just go with machine learning models and AI on the box, or just do this. No, we're just using everything we have, right? So it's a combination.
Thank you.
So, sorry, before we take the next question, I just wanted to call people's attention. There's a list of, we did a pretty broad brushstroke across the 3 product lines today. There are more details here on these sessions. If you're interested, you should check them out. Sorry, go ahead.
I work in the higher education space, and we have a rollover of a couple thousand people every semester, right? And some pretty effective attacks are very low. They're not complex at all. And that happens on a regular basis, is where they're doing basically social engineering through email. It might be an attachment saying that they send it from a valid address, but then the attachment says respond to this address inside of a text attachment, and it compromises students all the time. But they look basically the same, and the interesting thing is they always happen on the schedule. It's like the beginning of the semester, new students, or graduation. It's the same sort of thing, and those don't usually get flagged by EOP. And we're wondering we respond to Microsoft, said this is spam, and they look similar to us, and I'm wondering if there's anything to look at those schedules, like this type of email coming at this time, it's probably a threat or something.
It's a great question, and we've been working very closely with a bunch of EDUs because this is a problem that we see across the board.
It's huge. It's huge. We have students compromise bank accounts and stuff.
And I'm not saying this happens with your particular testing, but what we discovered is interesting. Exchange and Exchange Online is actually a pretty powerful tool set, and it's actually given customers the ability to go and tweak their spam controls or their filter controls. to the extent where we've actually seen a lot of these cases where they've inadvertently configured things that are actually letting in more of these attacks than otherwise. And the reason we've seen, and we've been working with a bunch of customers on this, and the reason we've seen a recent spike in activity is because the attack profile has actually morphed towards a lot more phishing of late, right? And so as we work with these guys, we see that, and I actually mentioned this because it's kind of a call to action for you folks, go review some of your transport rules should they exist. We've actually seen really wide open transport rules, and the effect of these things ends up being just bypass any filtering logic in EOP or at ATP even, right? And so that's one place to start. The second thing I'll call out is go check out Abhishek's session on Thursday at the same time, which talks about our fish protection, not just what we had in the past, but ones we've rolled out recently, as well as things coming online in the very near future across our EOP and ATP stack. And so I think that'll be, you'll find that hugely useful.
Well, along the lines of the configuration, because we've talked with some engineers about stuff like that too. I know that in the rollout of the Office 365 admin portal, they're going to start surfacing configuration things that was that going to be part of it as well, where you notice, hey, your transport rules are letting in more stuff? Are you going to surface that for us?
Exactly the reason we built that is so that we could actually catch this more proactively than you having to.
Cool, thank you.
So we're out of time, but we'll be more than happy to take questions if you just...
we stay.
We'll stay, we'll take as many questions as you have.
Just I don't think it's recorded, so there is no point in doing the mic thing.